Hello, everyone. Hi, it's great to see you. We're getting started here. I'm Karen Tucker, Churchill Club CEO. Thanks a lot for joining us tonight, and thank you, Autodesk, for hosting us in your gallery space. It's a great place for a visionary conversation. We appreciate it very much. And we also thank General Catalyst for their partnership in creating and presenting this event, which was catalyzed by an important new book called Unscaled, co-written by Hemant Taneja and Kevin Maney. Our hashtag is Churchill Club, and you'll find other Twitter information in your programs as well as full speaker bios. In our work as an independent platform for business and technology thought leadership, we try to illuminate opportunities for the three aspects of our mission: innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. And we approach these things through a spirit of exploration and definitely not a fait accompli. We also try to choose things that are not over-discussed and bring a new perspective to the conversation. Today, we are going to look at the premises of the book. We're calling the program The Unraveling of Scale. We're going to look at the implications of a groundbreaking wave of new technologies that are converging and seem to be coming of age, largely driven by AI, but also nanotechnology, 3D printing, virtual reality, and much more. So what do these incredible shifts mean for competition, for work, for society? With us to weigh in are Hemant Taneja of General Catalyst, Larry Downs of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, Sri Ambati of H2O AI, and they will be led in conversation by Kevin Maney of Category Design Advisors. One more thing I want to tell you, because gender diversity is a very important issue to Churchill Club, Autodesk, General Catalyst, and our speakers. We want you to know that we did make Herculean efforts to represent that here on our stage, but we're just not able to do so to get schedules to align. But we do have a remarkable group of people here to share their insights and their ideas with you. So let's bring them up now. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Churchill Club, for having us. Thank all of you for coming. So just a brief bit about this assemblage here and what we're going to talk about. Just a tiny bit of history. It was about 4 or 5 years ago that Hemant and I were introduced. It was right after he had written an article for Harvard Business Review about this idea of about unscaling, about how technology, today's burst of technology, was taking apart the scale that we built up in the 20th century and what that meant. And he and I had a drink in New York, talked it over. I thought it was such an interesting idea that I kept talking to him about it. Eventually, that ended up turning into the book called Unscaled that came out in March. The two of us wrote. Sri's got his copy, and Hemant and I co-authored that. Larry, next to Hemant, is one of the more interesting thinkers that I know about public policy and technology and disruption in public policy. So he's going to contribute to that. And Sri here is right in the middle of all of it with H2O, and essentially, as I understand it, essentially working to democratize AI and put it in more people's hands. So we're going to talk about that and what that ends up meaning. And I want to set the stage by turning to Hemant at the end here and saying that, I mean, one of the things that is obvious to all of us when we watch world events and politics and everything else that's going on is that the world is in a major state of turmoil and disruption. And I think that the book explains some of why that might be and what that means. So I wanted to have you explain what this idea of unscaling is and why why it's been turning both industries, all sorts of industries, and society inside out right now.
Thanks, Kevin. So if you think about the last century, scale has been a key measure of progress for us across every dimension, right? We scaled our power plants to make sure the country and the world is all electrified. We scaled our healthcare system, bigger and bigger hospitals. We've scaled our corporations, job creation. We scaled the government. Everything, it's all been about scaling. And it was to bring a basic level of services to society. And we scaled the middle class. We probably moved about 100 million people into middle class with a lot of the scaling that we did. China copied the same tools of scaling and probably created a 400 million person middle class in the last 2 decades of last century. But if you look today, I would submit that scale has actually run its course. Which of those systems in society is actually productive? Healthcare is practically bankrupting us. Education is not preparing our kids for the 21st century. Power gave us climate change. Scaling of food gave us diabetes. There's all these consequences of that came along with the benefits. And luckily, I think sort of 2007 on, this phenomenon that we called unscaling has also started. And what happened in 2007 is the intersection of the iPhone being available, the Facebook becoming a platform with Facebook Connect, and AWS becoming a platform for computing. It essentially completed every layer of what you need to be able to rent scale. So now you can, stand up servers and build a software-based business. You can access any person on the planet through Facebook and Twitter. You don't have to build a mass market media brand. You can go to manufacturing partners overseas and you don't need to build factories. You can use FedEx, you don't need a distribution network. Everything that you needed, that the incumbents had, essentially became rentable. And what it allowed the entrepreneurs 2007 on, if you just think about how much life has changed in the last decade. 2007 on, what it allowed entrepreneurs to do was fundamentally rethink these major sectors. And that's the phenomenon that we call unscaling. It's one because of the feedback loops and iteration with data and AI. And it's fundamentally changed our business as a venture capitalist. 15 years ago, if a founder came to us and said, I want to build a new insurance company, or I want to build a new car company, or I want to build a new healthcare services company, we would say, that's lunacy. Go sell software to the insurance adjusters and go sell software to the physicians. That's where you really can create venture capital returns. Today, we don't fund those. We are looking for, hey, let's go rethink education and parts of education, and let's go think about how diabetes ought to be reinvented from a care delivery perspective, et cetera. So that is all because the founders have this ability to be focused on their customer, focus on the product, and not worry about building the scale around them. They can rent everything that they need. And I think as we'll get into it, this phenomenon, we're 10 years into it, is you could not have imagined what life is like today from 10 years ago. Just imagine what it's going to look like in 20 years with a lot of the technologies you referenced earlier that are being built. I'll stop there.
And one of the things I think you've talked about is that because that's happening, this scale that we built up was very beneficial in a lot of ways. The 20th century, we solved a lot of poverty, education, all these kinds of things. But now all of those institutions are under stress because this is happening and tearing them apart. Could you explain a little about that?
Yeah. So we got lots of benefits. The healthcare system. So take healthcare system.
Please.
Way back when, this might take a long time. Way back when, you had this notion of a family doctor. They came to your house and knew you, your family, knew your issues, and gave you very personalized service. To bring a basic level of service, we started creating these healthcare centers, and it had great benefits in the last century. We dealt with trauma, infectious disease, infant mortality rates. Lots of improvements happened in society. But if you fast forward where that system is today, after having scaled for 100 years, now you go see a doctor. Maybe you'll get 15 minutes with them. It's almost always that they're late, and they're not even looking at you. And that is the quality of service that's actually bankrupting us. And what do those companies do to solve that, to get better? They merge with each other to even get bigger. Right? That's what's happening in that system, and you can see that pattern across every industry. And if you take diabetes, I would argue that the scaling of the food production is what caused diabetes because of the obsession with corn. And all of a sudden, we have 30 million people that have diabetes today. What does our scaled healthcare system do in terms of taking care of them? They're told to go see their PCP 4 times a year on a disease that really invokes itself any moment. And so if those 4 moments you go see the PCP and tell them here's what the blood glucose patterns were, well, if you were good enough to see the PCP, chances are you were actually okay that day. So all the episodes that are happening between those 4 moments when you saw your PCP, that is not the right way to treat diabetes or type 2 diabetes as we call it for these 30 million people. So we built a company about 5 years ago where we said, how about we actually give a connected glucometer to everybody that has diabetes that's in their pocket. They do nothing different than what they were doing 10 years ago. They check their blood glucose, the data goes into the cloud, and machine learning and AI monitors what's happening to them. And if they're deviating from a state of being healthy, they'll get a message from the machine learning system to say, hey, drink a glass of orange juice or go around the block for a walk. And if it's really deteriorating fast, they would actually get a call from a diabetes counselor. A personalized call, much like the family doctor that used to be 100 years ago. And that's the whole point of unscaling. And by the way, as you understand more about each individual, those 30 million people don't have a disease called type 2 diabetes. That's just a random categorization. The system understands their metabolic pathways at an individual level and uses algorithms to keep them healthy along the lines of what their body needs. So all of a sudden, you've got hundreds of different types of diabetes you're unscaling type 2 diabetes into and providing a much better level of service for those 30 million people. And economically, $100 billion of savings once this does get rolled out by companies like the one I referenced in the market.
Sure. Go ahead, Jerry.
On riffing off of the same theme, right? Sort of metformin, which was a common prescription for decades, turns out has highest readmission rates for diabetes. So simple AI picks it up. It has no bias, and we put as much data as you can, unbiased data as you can. Out pops scientifically data that says, and we presented that to physicians. They're like, oh, we knew that. We were suspecting that. And that's why a nice addition to that, and suddenly that's post-90s. So, but this knowledge is not not yet known because there are lots of other processes that have bias in there, have systemic biases in there. We actually think of healthcare as health divided by care. How little care, the optimization function should be, how can you live 100 years long without ever needing to go to the hospital? And so it's a very, almost the optimization function is not about healthcare, but it's actually health, like how little care. And which means that we may have to go back to where Heyman started the conversation. The future of hospitals, I mean, the book talks about a lot of things, and one of the things it missed is the future of hospitals. The future of hospitals actually is in your kitchen. In your restroom is the best place to pick up all the pathology you can ever get. And in your grocery chain, actually we're working with a grocery chain in Texas, the local one, and they're essentially, they're worried that Amazon has entered groceries, so they want to improve. And they want to actually deliver medicine almost through food, right? Sort of, and we've seen the same philosophy in the largest companies like Pepsi, trying to do healthy choices and put probiotics in a drink that usually doesn't have probiotics. And so kind of the direction that health is the only wealth to safeguard. And a large number of, I mean, we also help credit card companies to do credit scoring for subprime people, but turns out a large number of bankruptcies in the US are actually health related. So if you focus on this real health and making that as decentralized or unscaled, use the word of today, as possible, where everyone can figure out for their own personal health and well-being, the algorithm is actually working personalized, that then essentially you've cured the problem at scale again for the whole population of the world.
Well, I mean, to me, that was the key insight I got from the book, is that the way economies of scale work, if you put an economics hat on, they work by standardizing. So the way in which you can get scale in the old days was giving everybody the same thing. And so if it's insurance, you put people into a few basic categories from an actuarial standpoint, or if it's healthcare, you give one name to a disease that, as you say, has many hundreds of variations. And that, that's the best we could do in the industrial age. But now that we have this amazing ability to collect so much custom information and the software and the tools to use that information and then to turn around and give a customized solution, that's the revolution. I think that's what you're talking about. And it crosses a lot of these industries that worked in the industrial setting with economies of scale. Now they're effectively diseconomies of scale.
So I have a couple of follow-up things for actually both of you. So Sheree, I want to start with you for a second. And just back up a second, because have you explain a little about what H2O is about? Because, but in the context of this, if we're talking about something that's been so disruptive to industry after industry and to society as a whole, I mean, disruptive in not necessarily a bad sense, but in the sense of change, right? And if AI is a major driver of that, from what I understand about what you do, your idea is to actually make AI more prevalent and make it so it can be in everything. So tell us a little about what that is, but also what that means if you can now drive AI into like basically everything.
I think democratization in the current sense of the word is faster, cheaper, easier, right? So how do we make it faster, cheaper, easier so it's available ubiquitously everywhere? And we actually don't, so I think the people don't like to drink artificially flavored drinks or artificially colored things. So the word artificial intelligence does a big disservice to AI. It's actually intelligence. And we were training people before, we're training computers today. So it's essentially training, and so instead of programming computers. So we used to program computers before. Now with data, we are training computers, just like we are training school kids to do intelligent things. Mm-hmm. And so in some sense, it's actually much more ubiquitous already, where we like intelligent people or intelligent things that respond to change, react to change, not having to be told how to do it. And before we used to tell them through rule engines, what's called rule engines. And rule engines are actually the AI of 1980s, which is expert systems. So every time we had AI, the next 10, 20 years was software transformation or technology transformation, software and hardware. And so rule engines are how most of the policies are written today. And what we saw coming was data will print those rule engines for us automatically, so humans don't have to decode what the rule was. And so that's roughly what has happened with AI today. And the statistical learning as a mechanism to derive those rules instead of humans programming it. Think of it as Moneyball for business, Moneyball for almost everything, mm-hmm. and Moneyball for finding the right school, to Moneyball for finding the right place to be, which is today here. But those are the kind of things that you're essentially making possible everywhere. And with open source, and that's again another classic example of unscaling, we managed to distribute the software to almost the entire population of data scientists on the planet without major investments in marketing and the decentralization of media. We could actually exploit traditional, newer networks and get it into the traditional hands. So as a result, now it's become a mass movement. We started as software engineers who were appealed by similar problems in healthcare. For example, lumpectomy versus mastectomy. A decision was made by a surgeon in India for my mom. And I said, listen, that's not so cookie cutter, right? So when you start challenging those kinds of questions, you double click and the paper used appallingly small amount of data. So then we realized that, and I reached out to Sloan Kettering to see why, and they said, well, there is not good software to do this. So then I said, let's go build that good software, make it ubiquitous, so the real science where it's being done has the right tool chain. And so the tool chain, we said, should be table stakes. Turns out Google, Amazon, Goldman Sachs, Netflix, and Facebook, all of them had the best algorithms. And the algorithms in open source were really written by PhDs who wanted to leave their PhD and get done. And so we went and implemented those, plugged them into other open source networks, and before we know, we found a lot of community of mathematicians, physicists, and data scientists using it, giving us continuous feedback loop. This is the other thing that Hemant just briefly mentioned. It talks about it's all about the feedback loops. And continuous feedback loops improves systems and software systems. So today we are seeing the product is embedded in lots of places. And then what led to a phenomenon became a scarcity suddenly. There are not enough people who can build these AI models. And so we then reinvented ourselves a year ago by saying, how do we reduce the scarcity of talent in AI? And so now we have automatic AI, the AI to do AI, which is one of the preface you started us with. And AI to do AI is essentially using AI to help us build better AI systems, build the code needed to. So you put data in, you get code out to publish applications. So printing applications becomes a concept of you having enough imagination and courage and a purpose. So you can go get data, build code. And so that becomes a newer way where we can now empower 3 people in a room with a purpose and enough grit to go get data and then produce applications. So this is now democratizing not just AI, but democratizing entrepreneurship. And that's roughly where unscaling meets the H2O thinking is we really think that lots of great ideas die on the altar of not having good technology co-founders or enough attention, enough marketing. And so this brings, AI becomes a co-founder for any person with a good, great business idea and purpose.
So if you're building AI to build AI, so are you putting even AI developers out of work? No?
It's actually reducing their, to some degree, I don't recommend anything that I don't do myself. So the book, I had to read it before I could say, this is a great book, we should read it, buy it. I am an AI, and AI, if it doesn't replace my profession, then I'm actually not capable of giving it to others as well. So we practice it, and eventually when H2O is done, is when an AI program is running the company. And then you really have a truly visionary company where you can actually allow a lot of the 98% of the decision making we do is mechanical, actually. And there's 2% of which is inspiration. So how do you inspire a large group of people to think in one dimension or on one big mission or one big direction? I think that's kind of what humans are really good at. And since the invention of steam engine, we started learning the difference between 9 o'clock and 9:05 because you missed a train, right? So we started learning the art of exact timing, exact pitch, exact pieces, and started becoming more and more machine-like. And so we want to make machines do what machines are good at, and humans are really good at doing a lot of human-like things. And human beings are also processes, and how do you optimize those processes is roughly what AI can help us be more human. And the vision there is we focus now on feeling, focus on higher level qualities that can elevate what we could do if we had a lot of things that we do mundanely automated away.
But I will say now, so I'm going to turn to you, Larry, for a second, because as good in many ways as that sounds, this is also a conversation that scares a lot of people, and scares policymakers and all sorts of others. So you've thought a lot about what society's response to these kinds of things, or what government's responses to these kinds of things should be, especially when we're looking down the pipeline at the idea that are we all going to be put out of work, or are all of us going to lose all of our privacy to these big companies? I mean, how do you? I mean, it's a big picture question, but how do you address that?
Well, as you say, it's a very big problem. But my starting point, I think, for a lot of this discussion is always one of my favorite quotes from Arthur C. Clarke, who said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And if you think about historically how traditional governments have responded to magic, think about the Salem witch trials, the Reformation. You get the idea that
I believe that the first man who invented fire was burnt alive. The second man learned how to control it.
So it's a long history that says disruptive innovation, certainly in its early stages, is very scary because we don't we don't evolve as quickly as the technology does. And in fact, you guys talked about, the sort of combination of Moore's law and Metcalfe's law and how that really accelerates the disruption. Us normal people don't accelerate the same way. So it's inevitable that we have these conflicts at the border of innovation and society. And in fact, that they're accelerating is also not a surprise either. I have a colleague who refers to these as Techno Panics. And you can go back, and you don't have to go very far at all to find all sorts of earlier panic. We thought, video games were disastrous, and online pornography was going to end society, and so on and so forth. And the reality is that eventually a lot of these problems go away. They go away not because regulators with their long history and long processes and very slow movement figure out what to do about it. They go away because the next generation of technology comes along and either fixes the problem or just replaces the thing that was annoying us in the first place. And a lot of these are very also democratizing technologies. So you guys, again, you talked about how one of the interesting things about unscaling is that consumers now through social media, they pick the winning and losing products very quickly, right? So if you're making flat panel television sets, the number one most popular brand is making a profit. The number two, maybe slightly. Everybody else is really at scale because they have no leverage in the market. That's true for consumer electronics, but I think it's increasingly true for a lot of things. And so my starting point is always to say, rather than bring in the stakes and the pitchforks and the old processes of scaled governments, which, as you guys say, doesn't really work, to look for alternative regulatory models. And we have many great examples of that that I think are working if you can kind of get over your panic response in the short term.
Well, hey, man, you like to talk a lot about this idea of responsible innovation and things like algorithmic accountability. What does that mean? And is it realistic? Is it just high-minded ideas, or can it actually be implemented?
Yeah, so in Silicon Valley, we have this mantra, move fast and break things, and iterate. And I think that was okay when we were building games and media companies for entertainment. It's not okay when you are reinventing, core foundational services like education and healthcare and finance and so on. And so it's just watching this crop of entrepreneurs over the last 7 or 8 years build the businesses, but have this kind of a mindset has been quite troubling. And frankly, that doesn't work. I mean, we're already starting to see what happens when you're just using algorithms to optimize. Bias, intentionally or unintentionally, bias is there. You can weaponize it and do a lot of what happened in the elections, or you can be Amazon Prime. This happened for real. When they launched it in Boston, there was a zip code which was not the most affluent, and that neighborhood did not get the Prime service because some algorithms decided there's no demand there. Right? Well, there was no ill intent. There's nothing that the team there did that was wrong, but that's not how we operate as a society. We create equity in society, and so I think as we start to take more and more responsibility in software and in the way we build these products, the founders have to think about, well, what's good for their business in the short term has to be good for society in the long term. And so how do you make those kinds of long-term decisions in building your products? And that's what I really mean by responsible innovation. And I think to your point, as technologies evolve, regulatory frameworks have to evolve as well. So one of the other problems we have is, we're getting increasingly sophisticated in our use of AI and data here, but the government is, centuries behind in being able to understand it. So how do you really regulate when you don't have an understanding of what's going on? Where is the Department of Artificial Intelligence that actually measures what's happening in these software algorithms? When Microsoft was hit with antitrust, they actually sent regulators to their campus to see that they were conducting deals in a proper manner. What do you do today? Do you send people to go stare at servers at Google or Facebook to see if they're doing the things right or not? That's not going to work. So we need the sophistication around just software-defined governance as well. So I think
send AI, right? AI to regulate AI.
That's right. So both our role as the creators of this next economy, and then the role of regulation and the sophistication it requires have to evolve for this next phase.
So on the algorithmic accountability, clearly, who is responsible for it is I mean, with freedom comes responsibilities, and I think one of the things we see is that there's software to. So the theme of this question is trust in AI, right? Sort of, and do we trust in AI enough, and how do we trust in AI? And for me, it's like software. AI, our vision of it is science doesn't scale, so let's make it software. So, and software is eating the world, and that's why AI is eating the world, it appears like. And so essentially, all software now has AI in it, and so you run into it everywhere. And that's the ubiquitous theory, or anyway, thinking. And now, who owns the primary responsibility for that AI piece? And that's kind of really, there's two real problems or pieces to it. One is software piece, the math and software piece, which is, can we explain AI? Can we explain the decision? Why did it do that decision for that particular zip code? And we now have explainable AI as the next edge in the movement where we're trying to build, asking the model to spit out why and create surrogate interpretable white box or gray box models to understand why the AI did what in a black box. So essentially using AI to explain AI. And so that's one aspect. But the second aspect is data. And data is today, 98%, 99% of data is owned in a few organizations. And we need that to change, right? Sort of the 1% of us don't have much data. And so we need to get data into the hands of the owners of data, which is the individuals. And I think the book briefly talks about it towards the end, that every one of us who participated in the data, creating the data, should own the data. And once you have that, then you suddenly now can create this economy of scale that is working for the people as opposed to for the organizations that have a head start in AI.
Hey, Matt, were you going to say something on that?
Yeah, I think when you think about AI and companies that are using it to build products, the framework I often say is it needs to be accountability, transparency, and explainability. So first thing is design your systems in a way that it's accountable to sort of core values of society. Be transparent, so government and others can actually see what's going on, so it's easy to measure. And then explainability, so your users can actually understand what's going on as they make these decisions. And we're not there. That's not the mindset of how these products get built today. But there is a lot of conversation, and I'm hopeful this next generation of entrepreneurs will embrace that notion more and more, and larger companies, obviously.
So one topic that always comes up about this, I'm going to ask all three of you this because I think you may come up from different places on the answer, is do we really need to have a conversation about universal basic income, or is what's going on, like every other technology cycle that's ever happened, actually going to create more jobs and more more industries than it destroys? I'd be interested in all three of your takes on that.
Can the answer to both be yes?
Sure. Explain.
Well, so, we've had technology disruptions for however many thousands of years, but, we're in the midst of one that's a really big one and sort of not quite on the same scale of agrarian to industrial to information. It's on a similar scale. And one of the things, if you look historically at how these disruptions happen, it's inevitable that when that happens, you are going to displace a generation of labor. There will be, elevator operators, switchboard operators, people whose jobs, truck drivers, I think maybe a category that's going to be in this realm, where they're in a midpoint in their career, the career no longer becomes viable. It's really, some people can, of course, be retrained and go into other things, but by and large, you're going to have some very large group of people who cannot be retrained. They will effectively be retired. And then the question is, how do you provide for them? Well, either, it's ad hoc, or you do nothing, or there's a social safety net. That net can either be very strong, and you could argue that, basic income is a very strong safety net, or you could say, well, we have safety net now. It doesn't cover everybody, or it doesn't cover every situation, but, it's better than maybe what happened 100 years ago when a similar kind of disruption occurred. So I think on the one hand, absolutely, we'll have a large displaced labor force over the next 40 years. And at the same time, these technologies are creating massive new opportunities, but not for those people, for the next generation of workers. So yes, lots of new jobs, but also a very serious labor displacement problem.
And do we have to do something new to deal with that? And
Well, either we do something new or we do what we did the last time and say, you know, it didn't work great. Did it work well enough? That's, you know, that's the decision that society has to make is, you know, do we leave some number of people, maybe a large number of people, out of the safety net and hope that they don't, you know, revolt and burn down the Capitol, which certainly was a fear that we had at the turn of the last century with massive industrialization. That was, you know, that's really what drove Teddy Roosevelt to become a progressive, was not that he thought it was a great idea so much as he was afraid the alternative was you know, radical socialism and a you know, complete destruction of the government. So you either have that fear and you think he's going to do something about it, or you don't. But that's a social decision. It's not a technical decision.
where do you come down?
Yeah, so it's hard for me to think on a 50-year scale because you know, you just convince yourself that all technology will be able to do everything we do today, and you can't envision what the new jobs will be. So it becomes sort of this endless, frustrating debate. I can say for the next 20 years, there's a lot of dislocation to this whole unscaling point. So there's plenty to do. We do have to retrain the workforce to go create this next wave of innovations. To me, the question I think a lot about is the kinds of innovations we are building. What happens when, if and when they all come true? So I'm going to give you an example that I often talk about. You know, somewhere here in these neighborhoods, there's some company building self-driving trucks. There's probably a project going on basic income that you were just referring to, and you know, somebody's working on longevity and how do we live longer. Well, when you put those things together, you're going to have to someday go to 4 million truck drivers in this country and say, well, we've got good news and bad news. Good news is you're going to live 30 years longer. Bad news is no more work. And no more self-esteem because we're going to put you on a stipend, so no self-esteem or purpose. Well, that's a tough place to end up as an innovation ecosystem, saying that's what we just built. So I think those are the questions that are important because we do get to shape. We have a choice. We do get to shape what is the world that we're creating with these technologies, and being a bit more long-term minded and deliberate, you know, will go a long way.
What do you think, Shri? I mean, you know, if your AI is capable of actually running the company, you're going to even put CEOs out of work. So,
I think, I mean, well, like as I said, it's the reflection. It's sort of, I think the important aspect is that the still very scarce aspects. What makes us human is going to be at question, right? Sort of some level. And our belief systems, our values. What we're asking about AI is, like, are you ethical about humans? And are humans ethical about humans? Being in time. Heidegger talks about this at length in the 1930s, right? Centuries ago. People have been thinking about these problems for a long time, since Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, right? So not just now. I think and beyond, and before that, we come from India, where we were thinking about universal principles for a very long time. I think mathematical cultures, and that's roughly where we're entering the space now. But I think success today is, the side effect of success in the current system is inequality, right? So we are creating unequal society, even in the current existing system. And I think what AI provides is a way to equalize, democratize that for real, where you own your data. And if you do that, then there is a bit of universe in everyone, in that sense of the nature, being part in every particle, every dewdrop. And so in that sense, you actually have far more things at your fingertips today. The average citizen of today is more powerful than a king in medieval times. And so you are capable of doing a lot more. And are you effectively using 60, 70 years of your working life for a purpose, or are you actually sacrificing 40 years of that for a job? Most people have jobs, some people have careers, and some people are really driven to do something different. And I think we want more of those times. We want to increase the amount of time you're going to apply yourself to change the status quo and create more entrepreneurial thinking. Be the founder. So we don't actually hire employees in our company. We hire entrepreneurs and residents. And so we want to, more of the democratization of ownership is roughly what you're asking for. And that's possible if we now apply, capital has become democratized as well. Some part of the book talks about that. If you can democratize capital in a way that it incentivizes risk-taking, incentivizes ability of individuals to be founders, to be CEOs and of their own lives, and chart it in ways they can divide their time. I think AI is going to help that change happen. It's another tool. I mean, we could drive to New York or fly from New York. And so they're both possible. If you disagree with flying, you can obviously drive to New York. But AI can actually give you that wings to the next level of human, I would say. And that's a human-machine boundary, actually, where do we trust the machine more today than we did before? I think the answer is yes, thanks to all the developments that have happened. Do we trust it to do things in a way better than we would? And I think that, I mean, I watch Star Trek with my daughters, 8 and 6, and they ask questions that is data, why is data human, right? So data is the cyborg who's helping the captain to do better things. And does he have feelings? Can he laugh? And those are the questions that we get to ask now. And once that future that was imagined by Hollywood and Asimov and others over the centuries is made, we have a newer things to think about. A digital doctor, right, which is part of culture in Star Trek, it's not there around yet. And the inverse proportionality of oncologists to people in India or radiologists in Africa is really, I mean, there are higher level talents that will become, we can build a doctor in 30, 40 years of experiences, or build it with the data and software and now make it available everywhere. So I think the universal minimum wages is, or even, sorry, dollars is one part of it, but I think the next level is what can you get for that? I think that just gets more and more, you get more for the same life in many ways. But I think we need to, entrepreneurs in the Valley really think about the social impact of what they're doing. And I think I'm with Hemant on that part. We had to say no to a genius as my seventh employee because I looked around, everybody was male. So we had to go make sure we built that correctly from the early days. And ethics is really about not just what you have the right to do, but what is the right thing to do. And the right thing to do oftentimes is think long term. And long term is actually, again, 30, 40 years long term or 300 years. And if you can think centuries at a time, this is the beginning of every century. We had tremendous investment in physics and math, and that led to a flourishing century last century. And so now we have invested in that piece, and we will see unbelievable amount of transformation. People may live forever, and we'll have to decide what they do with that time. And we may actually end up seeing a lot of questions around how time and being are associated with each other.
I always preferred the career vision of the Jetsons. If you remember, George Jetson's job was that once a week he would fly his car to the office and he would sit at a desk that had one button in the middle of it, and he would press the button and then he would go home and complain about work, just like everybody always complains about work. So, you know, the 40-hour week is definitely not necessarily the definition of what is a meaningful career.
And there's been long, like 50 years ago, there were predictions that by now we were all going to be working 10-hour weeks, and now we work 60-hour weeks. So there's something we've been circling around a little bit with things about how long who owns your data, and Larry, about the way markets work, responsible innovation. Turn to you first, Hemant, about one of the things we get some pushback about right now is these idea of these monopolies that are controlling so much, and the way that digital markets work today makes that happen. So, do we need to do something about that? Is that a problem?
Yeah. So if you go back to 1928. Standard Oil, the Sherman Antitrust Act, you probably know a lot about this. a lot of it was around consumer protectionism, and there were these monopolies you could actually break down geographically. Now, the companies that we think about as monopolies, they fundamentally exist because of their ubiquity, right? And these are these network effects in Facebook, for example, or network effects, around data that Google has, and it's hard to figure out what does it mean to break them up. And the other thing is they actually provide great free services to consumers. So what's the purpose? And so the orientation has to change more towards creating a level playing field for business ecosystems to exist on top of these platforms, and these unscaled companies that get built on top of these platforms, how do they have a chance to survive? If they have a good opportunity, these companies can take advantage of the data, their access to their customers, and take that opportunity away. And that happens a lot, right? I mean, Amazon's getting into every business, for example, that you can imagine. So the question is, how is there a level playing field in business? And to me, I look at these businesses as their access to consumers, their algorithms, and their data. And so rather than looking at sort of geographically these monopolies, I look at it in these three layers. And from my perspective, you have to open up 2 out of 3 of these layers to create a true level playing field. So it's not enough to say, oh, you can use Facebook Connect and you can connect with people, and that's the API we're releasing. We also need the data, or you also need the algorithms, and so these frameworks need to be rethought as to what's going to create the level playing field. If not, we're going to see regulation that frankly isn't good for our economic future. You don't want to stymie innovation because 10,000 miles east, the analogous companies are being built that have got all the advantage in the world around AI and are scaling, and we will lose our global competitiveness.
There is
You mean
technology.
China. You didn't say China, but you mean
China,
China.
yeah.
Well, what's your response to that, Larry?
Well, I think that's mostly. I think that's mostly right. I mean, you're not going to get solutions from traditional antitrust law, and in fact, the Standard Oil breakup did not lower prices. The breakup of American Tobacco did not actually lower prices, and so even the kind of classic examples of where the Sherman Act was applied and where we think it was a big success, in fact, it wasn't a success at all. And certainly, if you're talking about markets where prices are going down because of Amazon Web Services has a certain scale, and because of that, prices go down. Of course, the technology itself is driving prices down. Or where you're offering products that are free, there is no, the sort of the basis of this is how are consumers being harmed, and what can we do to rectify? What remedy can we put into place to make consumers better off, to lower prices because the monopolists have raised them? Well, we're not in that universe, and certainly that whole body of law, that whole approach to regulation didn't work really in the past. It certainly wouldn't work here. But I'm much less, as I say, I'm much less concerned. Again, at the immediate moment, you can sort of point about what the New York Times calls the frightful five and say, well, clearly they've controlled everything, they've monopolized everything, we've got to break them up, we've got to regulate them. But I think those apparent monopolies are mostly transient. When I was doing some work a couple months ago on this, I came across this fantastic article from The Guardian in 2008, I think it was, and the headline was, "Will MySpace ever lose its monopoly?" Now, that seems hilarious now, but you may remember that MySpace was funded by Rupert Murdoch. This was not, it was not a fly-by-night momentary thing. In fact, it was a company that looked like it really could. And of course, it went away. Kevin remembers the days when America Online was what we were all worried about, and the walled garden was going to destroy the internet. So my general view is that these big problems aren't as big as they seem, but even if they are, the solution is not going to come from traditional law.
It's interesting you say that. Actually, you would argue Facebook would have lost its monopoly had it not been allowed to buy Instagram or had it not been allowed to buy WhatsApp. I mean, they've actually kept buying more and more eyeballs, right? That disruption would have happened. When Instagram was purchased, everybody laughed, wow, 15 engineers, $1 billion, that's crazy. And we didn't even understand what's going on. Commerce Department should have been thinking about, another 200 million eyeballs going to the same place in aggregation or distribution. So there are...
Now it's I just saw yesterday, it's now valued at $15 billion.
Oh, way more, even more. Instagram's probably $100 billion property now, yeah. And point being, now they have a couple billion eyeballs. So that the orientation has to change in how you think
Same
about
with
these
WhatsApp,
businesses.
right? Sort of, all the other 12 search engines that lost to Google got most of the talent got acquired by Google, and they've been Silicon Valley's funding philosophy of get rich quick mindset, if you will, has basically created a few big giants, but the rest of the Farava eating, like killing the babies in some sense, have been gone to get acquired by the large companies. And so, and then some, right? Sort of WhatsApp got acquired by Facebook. So you kind of have this reasonable sense of large companies, and the large companies are no longer moving slowly; they're moving very fast, actually. So the startups have yet another new barrier to go big, become larger, which is great. Innovation has become much faster. And to touch the topic of China speed, they are going even faster. And so some level, they've made, the government there is coming in and stopping anyone who has been to CES this year. About a third of the 1,300 companies came from Shenzhen of the 5,000 and one small place. And then lots of real support for smaller companies before they get acquired by the large companies there as well. But I think being able to
There's only really one company in China. It's China. Yeah, I mean, it's the government is the only real business.
yeah, so we do have good usage of our product there. So we see how they've taken our products, not just copied, they've reinvented it, taken TensorFlow from Google, let's say open source framework, reinvented it. And so now we are seeing better AI actually come, mostly because access to data is much more easier. Access to data here is like because of the innovators' legacy of years of large technology. I think big companies are unable to transform fast enough with AI. We are seeing the opposite effect in China. I think there's a real race here on who has the best AI. I think, and I think we feel like we want to essentially protect certain parts of the world where we can create the best-in-class technology. But I think the longer term here is how do we integrate it into our culture? I think being open societies, we do have that advantage. Being a mathematical culture, Asia has its own advantage. So there's a lot of interesting checkpoints along the way. The broader piece, which is a bigger one, is immigration and the topic of how do we continue to raise great talent and how do we kind of reduce the barrier to entry for existing talent. I think those are all the bigger challenges the society is facing. And part of that challenge is actually not able to democratize further everything. We need to democratize a lot of things, including access to technology, but access to capital, access to innovation, access to kind of information as well.
So let me ask one thing of all three of you before we open it up to questions from the audience. So if you've got some, be ready. And I think there's a microphone that will be going around. So raise your hand if you have a question. But before we close out this part of it, I wanted to ask all three of you. This has been, to some degree, a reasonably pessimistic panel.
What panel were you listening to?
I mean, well, in some ways. But I would love to hear from each of you something that you are really optimistic about that's coming out of all of what's going on right now. Evan?
I hope this wasn't a pessimistic panel. I think the point is, I just fundamentally believe technology is actually neutral. I mean, I think in the end, we're going to do the right thing, and life's going to fundamentally change in a lot of different ways. In the short term, I am a strong believer healthcare is going to profoundly change. Can't wait to see, both from a cost and quality perspective, how that changes over the next decade. I think we're starting to understand how to disrupt that ecosystem as the Silicon Valley set of teams that are tackling it now. And I'm also optimistic that you're going to go from the boring 8-hour workday to living what I think is going to be an entrepreneurial life. You get to learn and do new things that are your passions, and have a career and learning sort of intermingled, as opposed to 20 years to go to school and then 40 years to have a job. And I think that's going to be a much more engaging way to live.
Sorry, the pessimistic was probably the wrong word, but we were talking about the dark sides of a lot of things. So, but yes, but Larry, please.
I'm optimistic about everything. I know it's sort of in the current social milieu to think about the last 10 years and to really now focus not on how many ways technology has improved our lives, but to talk about the sort of negative social side effects, which I don't dispute exist, but they pale so much in comparison to what we've gained. But in the future, so a lot of these unscaled technologies, and you talk about this, but if you think about it, the real problems in healthcare and financial services and education, to pick three, are not the inefficiencies for those of us here, but for all the unserved people. So the billions of people who don't have any healthcare, who don't have any education, who don't have any access to banking. And the real promise of a lot of these technologies you're talking about is to solve that problem, is to give them affordable, customized, meaningful access. That's what I'm most, I think, optimistic about of this next generation of technologies.
And we argue in the book that there's just this opportunity now to reinvent everything, reinvent every industry in a better way, and including ones you wouldn't even think. Like you were talked about how energy and solving climate change is often seen as a burden, when actually it's one of the biggest entrepreneurial opportunities that is out there. Sharif?
I think the panel touched a lot of the interesting topics today. It's education, for example. We used to respect people with the most knowledge and who learned very fast. And so with machine learning, machines learning very fast, and most knowledge in the data centers, if you will, and then people will be looking for wisdom, right, sort of storytelling. How do you take 10,000 things and make it one? So how do you have that kind of ability to talk about your experiences and the experiences of lots of people in simple ways that you can convey to others? Storytelling, ultimate human endeavor, you can do more of it, right? Sort of ultimately, we're waiting to be grandparents to just tell stories. We can do that now, right? Sort of talk about monopolies and decentralization, blockchain. I was staring at an evolutionary graph of all the Chinese empires the other day, and during some of the evolution, you have multiple things going on. Right now, what's happening, you're seeing not just AI, you're seeing VR as the book talks, as it talks about blockchain. You're seeing decentralization of lots of things. And combinations of these can come together to make the individual even more powerful. And I think the belief, we want to teach our children to be strong, have fundamental strength, so they can essentially not just adopt AI, but live with it and get even better, right? Sort of where they can actually make AI listen to them, essentially. Any sufficient intelligent system, you have to kind of come to terms with it as opposed to trying to brute force it. And I think that's we'll see a lot more of. Ultimately, humility is the ultimate thing to learn. And I think getting that kind of learning, so if you have the humility, you can learn continuously. That continuous learners, so the individual is still the source of that, and being able to collaborate with other individuals, build teamworks and also find incentives at work where you can incentivize teamwork. Bringing several people from different walks of life onto the same place and getting them to solve a problem, that's actually still, again, a very unique human aspect. And how do we build those teams without actually having to create force or hierarchies? And those circles, how do you grow that circles across the whole planet? And go beyond just thinking about the country or the color, but go beyond and try to think about the universe. And I think that kind of expansion is about to happen. Universe being other planets as well, right? Sort of, we think of H2O, AI. H2O is needed for life on this planet, and AI for other planets. So I mean, this is a very long vision, and you need to have that kind of long-term thinking. Monopolies will be, like, I completely agree, they're temporary, transient. The next big thing will be even much bigger than the previous big thing. And the future, I mean, Alan Kay kind of very poetically said that the future is now. It's just not equally spread out, and we want to democratize and make it equally spread out. So.
Thanks, Sri. Well, so first, before the microphones come down, I just want to ask that we thank the three of these guys for doing this. It was actually really informative and wonderful. And please raise your hand if you have a question. I see one back here, one right here.
Hi. Thanks, great panel. I have a quick question. Recognizing that fear is so easy to use to manipulate people and motivate people, and that people are extremely afraid, most of the general public is exposed to AI through frightening the Terminator and other things. You've mentioned, how are you basically going to be able to trust your gray box experiments and validate that you can actually trust that AI and that it's in that explanation and you can trust the explanation? Specifically, as you bring it into healthcare, you know, I know that most people in the medical profession won't trust the machine's output unless they can see it with their own eyes.
It's a very good, pertinent question. And that trust, so explanations coming from the software or from AI are being proposed or are used by domain scientists. So the current domain knowledge, business people, physicians, drivers, right, and teachers, all professions are actually working with explanations to make sure, no, this doesn't make sense. This person deserves this credit. It doesn't make, or this data was biased. How do I unbias or create enough variance in the data so the reason codes coming out of the product are making sense? And so that's actually where the human-machine interaction, the feedback loops will make the explanation over time get better. Today, the explanation is almost, it's typical to hypothesis. So science is clearly the same, hasn't changed, right, from the Galileo times. There's data, the hypothesis, I collected this data, this was the observation, this is the conclusion, this is my interpretation. And so we are actually past the conclusion to the interpretation stage of a typical Nature paper. When I try to explain what is explainability, I give a typical Nature paper to the team and said, so the last part, interpretation, is a human function today. If we can, and AI has done all of this part, can I get AI to come to as close a PowerPoint slide about this, as close to a visual story about this? And then if it did not, Brexit happened, suddenly some other things are happening. Things that are not in the data can also have impact. So then if it did not, then how do I debug it? How do I trace it? How do I look at it transparently as I was looking at software? And I think that's kind of creating boundary conditions. I usually ask this question of how do you test AI, right, and the answer is that how do we keep each other in checks and balances? Is one intelligent system in the community of other intelligent people system are well behaved or behaved in one form. And so that's how you keep AI in check, is with other AI. And what is the min bar of performance to what is the high bar of performance? And so kind of creating a reasonable set of conditions for it to perform in good way. But to your point, I think that's actually the boundary of where humans have to make sure the AI is curated enough that over time it becomes really powerful enough. And usually you can trace down most of these to bugs in data collection, or bugs or issues in how data was interpreted or what column was put together. But the more we automate, the easier that pipeline becomes to human scrutiny. But 100%, that is almost the boundary of where we are working on in AI right now.
Did you have something to add to that?
Well, as I was saying earlier, I think it comes down to how you build these systems. So the whole accountability, transparency, and explainability framework needs to be embraced in how you build products. So accountability to me is making sure there's measurement systems that are looking for things like bias and issues. In other words, essentially create algorithmic canaries in your products. Look for where things can go wrong and then iterate. And that's only going to happen if you're building these measurement systems. Transparency goes back to here's all the data inputs that are driving this, so you know what's coming in. And explainability is about helping me understand, well, why is this radiology report suggesting I have X? Tell me what that means, as opposed to, oh, the AI system just spit out that I've got the following issue or not. So I think that framework across all the products, as we build them going forward, it needs to be embraced.
I think automation has come a long way. We have done automatic machine learning, which makes most of this less and less error prone. Overfitting is a common issue. Leakage is a common issue. We've looked at some radiology reports themselves where leakage from the test side to the training from the training side to the test side, validation side. These common top 10 pitfalls, we've now codified them as a way to almost catch early while you're building the model itself. So automatic brakes are there to help us drive faster. So we put a lot of these brakes in the actual making of the AI. And so eventually, when the model's built, where it's reasonably well-formed or well-formed model, where you can at least expect certain level of issues missing from it before it gets deployed. But this is one of the most so data changes. Data is capturing the world, and the world is changing rapidly, and so it's messy. And I call it data is universe is sparse, life is messy. Data is both sparse and messy. So data is very, very. The technical debt of an AI-based system is very high. So it needs to be built and rebuilt almost continuously.
Next question, please.
That's a good. That's a good point.
Yeah, but let's go to the next one and give others a chance. Yes.
Hey there. So in the first part, you talked a lot about sort of the democratizing aspect of the blah, blah, blah as a service and the capacity that is available from AI and how we can raise everyone's capacity. And sort of in the second part, we got into the consolidating aspects of data and feedback loops. And to me, those are sort of contradictory in that we're seeing more and more data concentrated in fewer and fewer players. And in the first wave of the internet, we thought, oh, this is all going to be wonderful. We're going to democratize everything. Publishing platforms, everyone's going to have an equal voice, rah, rah, rah. And that's not how it turned out. How do we make sure that this actually does become democratizing? You know, you talked a little bit about antitrust, but that's not a global standard. And so how do we solve global problems around that?
So I have a belief that the best companies that get created today, they actually create new streams of data that are really relevant for the problems they are solving. So in healthcare, you could argue, well, there's all this healthcare data sitting in electronic medical record systems, and if only you could make that open, you could actually do all kinds of AI and create digital diagnostics and therapeutics and whatnot. I would actually submit most of that data is crap, and build applications that engage with end users and your customers and generate new data that's relevant for the interaction that you care about, and do AI on that data. So the diabetes company I mentioned, they started out just providing this simple workflow with a connected glucometer that eliminated the hassle map that a diabetic has to go through to manage their disease. But over time, they've now created billions of data points around different folks with different metabolics and how their blood glucose varies in the context of their social and environmental data where they are. That's not sitting anywhere else. So they created an application, generated their own data, and are now building machine learning and AI-based insights to treat that population. That's the power of unscaling. Build these products that are great for the slice of population that you care about, and capture data in that context that is unique to you. The only place where we've had this massive monopolistic behavior you're talking about is really in commerce and media, because we've got these large platforms that have been created. In all these other places, I think there's a cadre of new companies that are going to get created that do AI on these new workflows.
Just a quick follow-up. Are those companies going to have the data in order to build good AI algorithms around them?
Yeah, so the question was, are there going to be good AI algorithms around for those companies? I believe commoditization of AI, much like commoditization of computing, is a unsolved problem. I actually think once that does happen, there's no reason for concentration of great companies here in the Valley. Then every layer indeed is rentable from anywhere in the world. And frankly, if you are trying to transform the healthcare ecosystem in the UK, an entrepreneur that lives there and has empathy for the system will create a better product, all things being equal. Today that might get done here because we have better data scientists and machine learning and workforce, but that will become a set of APIs at some point and it'll change. TensorFlow and a lot of sort of open source tools that are being built are the goal is that these become available to others over time. But I think it's going to take some time for these AI-based APIs to mature.
So open, sir. So the answer for that is the four-letter word open. And open source. When we started, Google Brain project was completely closed source, and TensorFlow was not open when it started. And we created an open source software that was actually an open platform that could compete with producing that level of quality of results, and being fast and accurate, force the ecosystem to be open on the software side. But that's only half of the equation. The other half is open data. And recently there was a finding that all fMRI studies for the last 20,000 studies were all flawed because of a software bug. Now, so then essentially you want to rerun those tests. The data is not around anywhere. So I think that kind of open data using blockchain, where you could essentially almost individualize the data and create that data democratization. That's ripe for change. We need civil rights movements for data, essentially. But the next level, to your point, to Hemanth's point, this is this phenomenon is going to be universal. There will be entrepreneurs everywhere solving local problems using good AI and data, and I think that's where the decentralization will happen.
Did we have another question in the audience? There's one in the back. I think Karen, maybe it's time for this last one. Great. One last question.
So there was some discussion about truck drivers being a possible career that could get replaced by AI capabilities. Well, why not other kinds of things that are considered more brain work, like physicians?
Them too.
Yeah. We have funded a company
Lawyers,
that's doing
especially.
precisely that, which is they want to build an AI-based primary care physician. So I think the point was, in fact, McKinsey did this study, and they took all the jobs and they broke them down into 800 physical and cognitive skills, and they did this map that said, okay, how and when does AI mature so that your robots and your cognitive algorithms will end up collectively replacing all those. And they decided sort of in 50 years, 90% of the jobs that we have today will just be better done. Who knows? It's a bunch of crapshoot, but in theory, if machines can think and machines can physically do stuff, and we can make that more and more sophisticated, you could argue that they'll do everything that we do. So yes, AI-based primary care physician is being built by probably about a dozen companies right now in the Valley.
AI, we have built, working with some of the best auditors in the world. We've actually, in PwC, we've actually built automatic auditors, right? It's automatic accounting, but even underwriting with insurance, automatic underwriting. Underwriters are one of the most expensive part of insurance. So there's a ton of various large companies being broken down, unscaled to micro businesses. And that micro businesses is specialized AI for these functions, and that are becoming democratized. So then automatic radiologists to automatic pieces of the big physician into smaller pieces. Booking, we found that we're not using the same level of algorithms to book someone as when they go to a hospital. We use much more sophisticated models to book a seat on an aeroplane than a seat in a hospital. And I think, or how someone treats you when you walk into ER, automatic ER triage with data is much more, half of all fatalities in hospitals because of ICU transfers, mispredicting ICU transfers can have a fatality. And so that's, again, it can be automated, and there's less bias of how you came in and how you looked at when you came in. But I think the larger piece, which is, it's not about the replacement, I think I would say it is making sure it's more efficient. And once it's efficient, what else can we do in the same spaces?
Yeah, but clearly, just to make this really the bottom line, no industry goes untransformed. We don't know how, and we don't know when. That's the difference between a successful venture investor and an unsuccessful venture, is being able to do a better job of predicting the how and when. You're not going to get it exactly right, but the better you do, the better you're going to be. But there's absolutely no industry that will be left untouched.
Great. And I mean, on that note, I think we should.
I think the one piece is,
That's not on that note.
Stephen Hawkins had a list as well, along with McKinsey. The one place he actually thought AI will never replace is elementary school teachers. And we are here because of our teachers, and because dealing with children are so fast learners, you need even more faster learning systems to keep up with them. So some of the professions that are untouchable are kind of like the pieces like nurses, elementary school teachers, which take a far higher degree of patience, and the ability to build those systems actually is considered very difficult for AI, but we are trying.
All right, Sri, Larry, Hemant, thank you very much for doing this. Please, one more round. Karen?
Thank you very much indeed, and Kevin for guiding the conversation so masterfully. As a very small token of our thanks, we have for you the traditional Churchill Club speaker T-shirt. Please wear it in good health. As a courtesy, if you're interested, there are unscaled books available for purchase on your way out, and you've been a wonderful audience. We thank you so much for coming out. Have a great night. Good night.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. Thanks, Larry. All right.